Hey Adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey Adapters, what a treat. Today our guest is Dr. Shalini Vajjhala. Shalini is a founder and CEO of Refocus Partners, an integrated design and finance firm dedicated to developing resilient solutions for vulnerable communities around the world. Prior to starting Refocus, she served in the Obama administration at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Shalini received her PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. Shalini will go into detail about the concept of climate finance from the macro to the micro level. She shares how to bring core finance considerations into early stage project development and design, and how non-finance experts can get smart about climate finance opportunities. Hi, Shalini. Welcome to the show.
Hey there, Doug. Great to be here.
All right, we've chatted before, but I'm so excited to get you here on Simpatico, doing the work that you're doing. And, you know, based on our previous conversation, I never thought we could make something like procurement sound so exciting, but you did. And the feedback was like you'd made it. So we're going to do that here, but welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, procurement and more, right? Let's do it.
Just jump right into perfect. Seriously, it was very exciting. I learned so much. But let's just get some background. So you are at Refocus. You founded this. What is Refocus?
Refocus is a unique little shop. We are generally about 5 people strong, and we work at the intersection of design and finance. So when I was in the Obama administration, I found myself oddly building public-private partnerships for green and sustainable infrastructure. And that was largely because we never had enough money at EPA for all the things we wanted to do. So if you think about dealing with urban stormwater issues or protecting tribal communities from flooding, we had to get really creative about finding other resources and spending other people's money. So when I stepped down, it happened to be shortly before Hurricane Sandy hit. And that completely changed how folks started thinking about resilience. You know, what are these things that actually have protective value, not just investments after the fact in disaster recovery? And so I was strangely railroaded into setting up a social business. And so Refocus was born post Sandy to really run an experiment based on what we did at EPA, which is, can we do effective pre-development for infrastructure, working with communities in ways that creates $100 million plus scale climate benefits on the mitigation and the adaptation side. And so in the 8 years that we've been out here, we've actually found it really much more interesting to hire whole firms and partner with large companies than to build up our own staff and team. So we stay nimble and we can actually solve the problem that communities have rather than provide them with the staff that we have.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask is, who are your clients? So you are working with, private corporations, but local government, city government, who are your clients?
Yeah, so our clients are about 1/3 government, and that's at all levels. So direct contracts with cities. We also work with federal agencies to solve bigger picture problems that are more policy oriented. And we partner and work directly contract with international institutions like the World Bank, the UN, and international aid agencies that are interested in protecting their investments in global development.
All right, so let's talk about climate finance, and that can take many shapes and forms. But in the area that you're doing, what does that really mean?
So climate finance means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So let me start at the top, right? Climate finance in the news is generally the big number commitments, the billions and trillions of dollars that we either have or that we need for financing adaptation and mitigation. So that's what you pay for. Those big numbers are generally commitments. They're promises from governments to provide support to other levels of government. And and the way that this works is that we tend to think about these big commitments immediately drawing a line to how much we reduce greenhouse gas emissions or how much we protect communities from climate impacts. But it rarely works that way. The commitment takes years to translate into how dollars flow to communities. So,
Okay, so let's think about this financing and the planning associated and trying to track it down. You obviously recommend thinking about this very early in the process, and so I mean, why? How early?
sorry, can you repeat the question, Doug?
That's so the notion of like planning, like planning out the climate finance and you're looking at what sort of money that you might need, and like it's just even some of those material that you have shared is you really have to start thinking about this early in the process. And so I guess what does
Yeah.
that look like?
It actually looks like figuring out who loses money if if we don't address a climate impact. So I work much more on the resilience side than the emissions reduction side. So let me start there. When you're doing effective work on climate adaptation and resilience, generally what you're trying to do is keep something bad from happening. Sea level rises, but a community isn't flooded, or urban heat goes up, but you don't have older people suffering from heat health impacts. If you think about this in the frame of what doesn't happen, climate finance looks a lot like trying to find money for prevention in healthcare, right? You want to help people before they get sick, not wait to help them after the fact. And so a lot of what we do in the finance space is really ask the question and flip it around. Who loses money if we don't make an effective investment in an adaptation or a mitigation solution?
All right, so let's say you're working with a private corporation. What are some? I mean, they're obviously trying to plan. If they're doing resilient planning, they're thinking long term. What are some of the specific projects that you're working on with them?
Yeah. So, Doug, I know that I've got a funny thing here where my speakers keep shifting off to a Bluetooth headset. So if I'm cutting in and out, apologies.
You sound just fine. I see that you're on looking at something. It's okay, and that
Yeah,
you there hasn't been any cut in. So just
keep
go with
talking.
it. Don't worry about what you're seeing because everything's been fine.
All right, fantastic. So, what we do with communities and with corporations, if you think about large asset holders, so take a water utility or a transit authority, we will generally work with them in three entry points. The first entry point is they'll come to us and say, we had a major disaster. We're trying to figure out how to be better off the next time. So that can be anywhere from, think Houston after Hurricane Harvey dumped 50 inches of rain on the city, or the eastern seaboard after recent hurricane seasons, or the Caribbean. And what we do in that case is we'll look at what were the impacts of the disaster. How do you actually help ensure that the building back isn't just rebuilding what you had, but leaves you more sturdy in the face of the next event, which is always inevitable. The second doorway that climate we really tackle climate finance through is the freaked out, I no longer can afford something that's very important for my operations in a city, in a community. I'm here in San Diego. San Diego imports a huge amount of water every year, and climate change is going to make that harder and harder to do. And rather than thinking about this as a zero sum game, how do you get ahead of those resource needs? The third piece that we have folks approach us through when they're thinking about climate finance, but not realizing that's what they're talking about, is they'll come to us and say something has just become wildly unaffordable. So if you think about wildfires and insurance markets collapsing because wildfires have gotten so expensive. So you need insurance, you can't buy it. What do you do? And so those three doorways are all doorways into climate finance for us, starting at the project level, starting at the solution level, rather than this big macro commitment idea of we need $1 trillion. And what's fascinating about coming in from the bottom up is that early in the design process, you can actually say, all right, here's where you're hemorrhaging money. Transit systems in high heat, your tracks bend. It's that simple when you have too many high heat days in a row. So what do transit authorities do? They run fewer trains and they run them more slowly. That has a direct budget impact. They're doing less of what makes them money. And so we think about climate finance in that very bottom up way from both a cost and a benefit standpoint, rather than looking top down at how do you focus on the instruments, carbon credits or fancy innovative finance tools. We really try to bring it down to the basic questions and take the jargon out of the equation, which is who loses money? Are you going to lose more in the future because of climate change? Where can you create savings and capture that value? And then what are the ways that you protect your investments?
Okay, so let's say it's a local government that is thinking about all those different things and they still need access to finance, and the whole idea that you have to come up with innovative financing techniques to do these kind of things. Whoever ultimately is going to be writing the checks, if that city government is kind of ticking off those boxes that they're thinking like that, is that where there's a sort of agreement that, okay, we are going to provide you with funds because you have thought of these things, because you're being responsible? Is that how it's kind of happening now?
Well, what's interesting is once you think about these things, it actually opens up different colors of money for you to tackle a problem. So if you think about a water system that is the biggest power consumer in a city, when the power goes out due to high heat, let's say, you have a boil water advisory. Typically, a water system would only apply for water funding or do bonds for water funding. In this case, by widening out the problem, you actually can take in energy efficiency resources, or you can look at how to buy a power system to support your water system that's more stable. And so looking at completely different colors of money just on the public side. This isn't even about private money at this stage. I think one of the best kept secrets in climate finance is we aren't even using the public money that we have very well for doing these kinds of projects. And it's because of the lack of understanding about really where big ideas about climate finance connect to project design. And so when we do this work, our measure of success is really, can we get shovels in the ground and can we move money toward measurably reducing risk? And when you measurably reduce risk, all of a sudden that opens up a whole different way of looking at your balance sheet, because it's generally about things that you're already paying for or that you're on the hook for.
So what have you learned? You're actually not that old of a company, 8 years, and but you are dealing with things that you're planning for the mid to long term with some of this infrastructure spending. Have you been able to track with some of your projects, like, well,
Yeah.
it was stress tested in this kind of storm event or the wildfire, based on some of the work that you're doing, because you are trying to come up with this resilient investment? Like,
Mhm.
what are you seeing? Like, has the infrastructure you've been involved in kind of held up?
Well, so we're still, you're right, 8 years is very young in the infrastructure space where it could take 10 to 12 years to get a project from design to construction. One of our earliest projects is one that you and I had talked about on your podcast, which is this work in the city of Hoboken to build an integrated flood mitigation green infrastructure solution that's partially paid for by parking fees. So think about a sponge that provides recreational space. That project right now, we started the work in 2013 with the city to really figure out what they could do, and it's just under construction now to be completed in 2022. So that gives you a sense of how long it takes to do these projects and why it's so important to get financing into the discussion early. Because if you think about doing this and leaving it on the drawing board and then taking another 10 years to do, that puts us 10 years further away from our mitigation and adaptation goals. So we haven't yet seen projects stress tested, but we have seen them tested in pop-up installations, which is one of my favorite interim steps that's going to be really important, I think, in the next decade. So when you're planning a gigantic piece of infrastructure, say redoing a whole water system, instead of waiting and chain link fencing off parts of your city, what some cities are doing really well is doing temporary installations to test performance. So everything from movable green infrastructure, so planters to absorb water, boardwalks to let water sheet underneath and simulate porous pavement. I think these temporary installations are going to give us a great window into pre-stress testing before projects are actually built and informing design. And they're also going to make it a lot more palatable for communities to do mega projects and large scale retrofits, because it doesn't simply make something unusable or unavailable through a 5-year design and construction timeframe.
All right. So what about non-finance experts, and maybe these are city officials or
Mhm.
planners and such? How do they get smart about these climate finance opportunities that you're talking about? Because a lot of them don't even know these opportunities are out there, or what are sort of the metrics, or what's a really good way of doing that. Well, what would you say to them?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is do not be intimidated by the jargon. Finance in your world boils down to one big thing, which is how do I pay a project back? And what makes that different in the climate space is really we're talking about future benefits in most cases, right? And so I'm going to give four strategies for architects, engineers, project developers of all stripes to just break free of all the, if you Google for climate finance, it's harrowing, right? You'll get a whole bunch of finance jargon. Instead, think about what are the ways that I can combine projects for something to pay for itself and help cross subsidize something that might not pay for itself. The Hoboken example is a perfect one. We know how to finance parking. People put their cars somewhere, they pay for it. In the case of Hoboken, putting your car in something that also helps hold water in a storm um, is a great way to pay for two things at once. No one will call that climate finance. That's a municipal bond. So don't get attached to the terms. Think about the way that you pay for reducing your risk through something that already pays for itself well. So that's thing one. Thing two is combine projects across sectors. The example I gave of the water utility and the electric utility is a perfect one. Electric utilities are constantly looking for ways, especially under climate scenarios, to reduce their peak, right? You've got a lot of folks on different episodes talking about this, but the peak is where the power goes out, basically. And if they can shave that down and have their biggest users help them shave that down, those users can help negotiate well, if I save you this much, if I reduce your likelihood of having the power go out or your liability from having the power go out, then help finance my water system to do that, to make me more energy efficient. So that's a way of just engaging in direct partnerships for win-wins. But you have to be able to look and see who's on the hook for something that you're doing. Could be roads and stormwater, could be water and electricity. A great example from my time at EPA is we used landslide money to help pay for water infrastructure because the Defense Authority that was constantly cleaning up landslides was the one that was on the hook. And the water agency didn't have money to keep the water from sheeting off hillsides. So you've got to figure out who loses money in that case. The third thing I would say in terms of incorporating finance early into design decisions is we are taught as designers to think about costs and to be progressively smarter about how much a project costs. But what that leads to is a lot of engineers and architects will default to trying to shave down a project or make it smaller to make it more palatable to fund. Zoom out. Don't do it. Don't cost cut. Focus on the revenue side. So rather than shaving out the climate benefits of your project, so green building developers will feel this very keenly, right? You put in all the things and they're treated like bells and whistles rather than a fundamental piece of a project that's going to make the world a better place. Just to return to Hoboken, Hoboken was a city in crisis, right? It was under 12 feet of water after Hurricane Sandy. And if they had looked in their wallets and said, what could we afford? They might have had a few $1,000,000 for a water pump for the next storm. Instead of taking that approach, instead of budgeting for what you have, plan for what you need and then look for the resources to pay for it. And those resources should be public and private. And so that's the third thing that I would say is zoom out. The last thing I would say is don't focus on the funding sources. Focus on the way that you can pay back the funding sources. And every single project finance expert will talk to you about the mechanics of debt and equity instruments, but the bottom line comes down to innovative finance is only worth it if you can pay it back. And often the more innovative mechanisms take a lot more work. So a green bond takes a lot more documentation than a plain vanilla municipal bond.
Hmm.
Do the easy thing. Do the cheaper thing. Look for the money that's already out there and underutilized. And a lot of state and federal agencies in the US will tell you that they are desperate for applications for good green infrastructure projects. And I think that's a way to demystify how finance is presented to designers. It's not about the source of money, it's about how you pay it back through your project design.
All right, so I'm getting some comments and questions in the community room, and Mike asked a question about case studies, and I think your Hoboken one was a good one, but he also just provided a comment. We need to bookmark this episode and have adaptation and city planners take a look at it. Love how Shalini is making these steps really easy to understand and be practical. Mike appreciated that. And then Ken asked the question, what is the role of community coalition building in this work? What types of stakeholders have come to the table? Is your team doing a lot of education?
Yeah, we do a ton of education. That's a great question, Ken. We early on in our work at Refocus, we realized that we were designing projects that created benefits for insurance companies. And it took us a couple years to figure out how to crack this nut. So I want you to think about if you build a seawall or a coastal wetland or mangrove. In theory, everything behind that should be better protected, right? And you should see a reduction in your insurance rates. In practice, it's a little bit like calling up your health insurance company and saying, I'm going to the gym. And they will say, that's great. And, pat you on the head and send you on your way with your rising insurance costs. So what we had to figure out was how could we build coalitions of folks that were actually going to be better off with the projects we were designing to be able to cycle money back into those projects so that we could fill funding gaps. And in the insurance space, what this looked like, we actually found ourselves putting together a pretty unusual partnership of a major reinsurance company, a big bank, Goldman Sachs, and what's called a catastrophe modeling firm. And these are not local community stakeholders, but we needed them to get to the local level. So what we did is we said, look, we realize we're creating these insurance benefits. We don't have any way to capture them. We have an idea for how to do it. And it's to take something that already exists in the insurance industry called a catastrophe bond, and we're going to tweak it. You guys tweak it all the time. You offer these bonds and you say, well, you've built more buildings, so now we need to adjust the bond to account for your extra risk. We said that should work in reverse just as easily. Instead, how about we built our seawall, so now we've reduced the risk. So reduce the pricing and pass along the savings. So this is health insurers do this, or life insurers do it if you quit smoking. And it's because they know how much the risk is coming down. So what we did in reaching out to these stakeholders was we said, let's test this idea. And over 2 years, we figured out how you could do the modeling, what it worked well for, and then how you can actually tweak a financial instrument, a major insurance instrument that is used for $30 billion worth of transactions to date. So this is not enormous, but it's out there and trusted by investors. And so we actually built a coalition of folks to do this. But the whole reason was to get down to the community level to folks who were renegotiating the heights of seawalls in town meetings without any visibility on what the financial implications of that are. So you were just competing with your protection abstractly against your views very, very specifically. And so we're trying to balance out that scale. And so coming through both of those doorways, from like the industry and the top down, all the way to the community level and that town meeting level, we try to engage with every stakeholder that has a vested interest along the way. And we try to do it very, very practically about what it is that lets the project get done. So we really avoid generic conferences or discussions about resilience, kind of like the plague. And instead, we try to roll up our sleeves and say, I understand this is blocking your view. For every 6 inches that this changes, that will cost your community $50 million or $100 million. Now let's talk. How do you want to make that trade-off in an informed way?
All right, we're getting toward the end of the episode here, but I have another question from Lisa in the community room, and then we need to wrap it up. But Lisa asked, can you expand on, quote, desperate for good green projects to fund with some more tangible examples?
Sure. I'll give an example of an organization that I love. It's the New Jersey Environmental Infrastructure Trust, or the Infrastructure Trust. And they are one of many state organizations that gets federal funding from EPA through state revolving loan funds. And they have to distribute that money every year to municipalities, to water utilities, anybody who runs a water system for safe water and clean drinking water. And oftentimes they have set asides for things like green infrastructure. They can offer a loan forgiveness. They're required to spend a certain amount. And it's a huge challenge for them to get project applications in the door. And they're looking for both good projects and credit-worthy borrowers. So the challenge there is oftentimes the small communities, the medium-sized communities, just don't have the capacity to do all the design work to even submit an application. Or, like when I started this work, it was a lot of communities were still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. And so their credit ratings were a hard knock against them. And so I think you see that in a lot of states. So you talk about the big federal funding, and then the mechanics are really where it gets down to the local level. It's not about the massive climate finance announcement. It's about getting those projects and borrowers into the pipeline for using those funds well.
Okay, so
I hope that came full circle. Yeah.
we did. That was wonderful. Okay, last question just before we wrap this up is, it's sort of a running joke that this coming up week is going to be Infrastructure Week. It's like we've been talking Infrastructure Week now for 4 years. Are we going to have, and this is going to obviously be very relevant to you and especially the type of infrastructure that they might invest in, but let's say it's a Biden administration, do you think we'll realistically, as a way of reinvesting in the United States, is having an Infrastructure Week? Is that going to happen maybe in the new year?
I actually hope that we have a much longer than a week discussion about infrastructure as a means to COVID recovery, as much as laying the groundwork for the future of climate mitigation and resilience that we need. And so I'm really hoping we make some strong lemonade out of these horrible lemons of this past year, to be able to set the stage for bringing these things together. Infrastructure is a means to an end, and the ends are about serving communities and setting up for the future that we want. So our infrastructure should promote our long-term well-being, and that very much means tackling climate change as part of the discussion. So I'm optimistic, but you have to be in the field that I'm in. So we're going to keep fighting the good fight.
Well, I don't think all the sort of the unemployment has truly kind of made itself the impact, at next 6 months, 12 months, it's really just going to make itself known. And so investing in infrastructure is probably going to be a key way of maybe putting a lot of people back to work. So like you said, it's a huge opportunity with what's going on with COVID. So hopefully have that kind of coordinated national response. Shalini, this is fabulous. It's just blew by. I look forward to having another conversation with you on Simpatico. I want to bring you into just chatting. This is where we kind of close out the episode, but thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, just hold on. We'll be right back.